Welcome to the Lord of the Dark. The Tyranids don't worship a god in any traditional sense, but the hive mind itself functions as something far more terrifying, a collective psychic consciousness of unimaginable scale that guides trillions of organisms with a single, unified hunger.
The hive mind is not a mere instinct. It is a will so vast it eclipses the light of the Astronomicon and makes souls wither in terror.
Some theories suggest the hive mind may be evolving into something resembling a chaos god of consumption, while others believe it's fleeing from something even more horrifying in the void between galaxies. The truth about what the hive mind truly is, and whether it possesses genuine sentience or divine-level awareness, remains one of the most unsettling mysteries in the 40k universe. When we talk about the Tyranids, we're not discussing an empire with rulers, a species with culture, or even a swarm with leaders in any conventional sense. We're talking about something that fundamentally breaks the rules of how life, consciousness, and existence work in the galaxy. The hive mind isn't a brain sitting somewhere in space, commanding its forces through psychic radio signals. It's not an emperor giving orders from a throne. It's something far stranger, far more alien, and honestly far more terrifying than anything else humanity has ever encountered in the grim darkness of the far future. The hive mind is best understood as a collective consciousness, but even that term doesn't quite capture the sheer wrongness of what it represents. Imagine every single Tyranid organism, from the smallest ripper to the mightiest bio-titan, connected by invisible threads of psychic energy. These threads don't just carry commands or information. They literally form a single mind distributed across trillions upon trillions of bodies scattered across the void of space. Every Tyranid is simultaneously an individual creature and a tiny fragment of something incomprehensibly vast. When a Hormagaunt charges into battle, it's not making a choice in any meaningful sense. It's acting as a single neuron firing within a brain the size of multiple galaxy-spanning fleets. This is where the hive mind gets genuinely disturbing to think about. Humans have hierarchies. The Imperium has commanders, generals, and ultimately the Emperor himself. Even chaos has its dark gods playing their eternal games. But the Tyranids have achieved something that no other faction in the galaxy can replicate. They've created perfect unity of purpose without any possibility of dissent, rebellion, or internal conflict. There's no politics within a hive fleet, no ambitious generals plotting coups, no soldiers questioning orders. Every organism exists purely to serve the whole, and the whole exists as a singular will focused entirely on one goal: consumption. Fans have debated for years whether this makes the Tyranids more or less dangerous than factions like Chaos or the Necrons. Some argue that the lack of individual ambition makes them predictable, that they'll always choose the most efficient path to their goal. Others counter that this very predictability makes them unstoppable because there's no ego to exploit, no pride to manipulate, no fear to weaponize. You can't negotiate with the hive mind. You can't bribe it, threaten it, or appeal to some sense of honor or self-preservation. It simply wants to consume everything, and every single Tyranid in existence shares that want with absolute conviction. The lore describes the hive mind as something that exists partially within the warp, which is where things get really interesting and really scary. The warp, as we know, is the realm of emotions, thoughts, and psychic energy. It's where chaos draws its power, where souls go after death, and where the nightmares of sentient beings become horrifyingly real. The hive mind has such an overwhelming psychic presence that it actually creates a shadow in this dimension, blocking out the light of other psychic phenomena wherever Tyranid fleets travel. This isn't just a tactical advantage, it's a fundamental statement about what the hive mind is. It's so psychically massive that it warps reality around itself simply by existing. What makes the collective consciousness of the hive mind truly alien is that it doesn't think like we do. Human consciousness is built on individual experience, personal memory, and unique perspective. Even the most devoted imperial citizen has their own thoughts, their own dreams, their own fears. The hive mind experiences existence through billions of eyes simultaneously, processes information through countless neural networks working in perfect synchronization, and makes decisions that account for variables across light years of space. It's not just a bigger brain. It's a completely different type of intelligence that we might not even recognize as thought in the traditional sense. Some inquisitors who've studied the Tyranid threat have theorized that the hive mind might not even be conscious in the way we understand consciousness. It could be more like an incredibly complex biological computer, processing input and generating output without any inner experience at all. But others argue that something this vast, this psychically potent, must have some form of awareness. The debate continues because nobody has ever successfully communicated with the hive mind. Nobody has ever looked into its depths and returned with understanding. All we know is that it hungers, it directs, and it never, ever stops. So we've established that the hive mind is this incomprehensibly vast consciousness spanning galaxies. But here's where things get truly mind-bending. How does it actually control trillions upon trillions of organisms simultaneously? We're not talking about a few billion creatures here. We're talking about numbers so staggering that they make the entire population of the Imperium look like a rounding error. Every single Tyranid organism, from the smallest ripper to the most colossal biotitan, operates under the direct or indirect influence of this singular will, and understanding the mechanics of that control reveals just how alien and terrifying the Tyranids really are. The control structure works through a sophisticated hierarchy of synaptic creatures, and this is where the hive mind's genius becomes apparent. At the top of this psychic food chain, you have the most powerful synaptic organisms, hive tyrants, Norn emissaries, and the swarm lord itself. These creatures serve as the primary conduits through which the hive mind's will flows into real space. Think of them as massive psychic broadcast towers, constantly receiving instructions from the hive mind and transmitting those commands to lesser organisms in their vicinity. A single hive tyrant can coordinate the actions of millions of lesser creatures within its synaptic range, directing them with the precision of a master chess player moving pieces across a board. The really unsettling part is that these hive tyrants aren't just following orders. They literally contain fragments of the hive mind's consciousness, making them extensions of that greater intelligence rather than independent commanders. Below the hive tyrants, you have a cascading network of lesser synaptic creatures that extend the hive mind's reach across entire battlefields and planetary surfaces. Tyranid warriors serve as crucial relay nodes, maintaining the psychic connection in areas where the larger synapse creatures cannot reach. Zoanthropes and neurothropes function as specialized psychic amplifiers, boosting the signal strength and allowing the hive mind's commands to penetrate deeper into contested territory. Even relatively small creatures like broodlords maintain synaptic control over their genestealer broods, ensuring that no Tyranid organism ever truly operates alone. The whole system creates a layered network of psychic control that's remarkably resilient. Destroy one node, and the signal simply routes through another. It's like the galaxy's most horrifying mesh network, and every creature is both a receiver and a transmitter. What makes this control mechanism truly frightening is its absolute nature. These aren't suggestions or general orders being passed down. This is total dominion over every aspect of a creature's existence. A Hormagaunt doesn't decide to charge that guardsman because it feels hungry or aggressive. It charges because the hive mind has calculated that this is the optimal action at this precise moment, factoring in thousands of variables that no human commander could process. The creature's muscles fire, its scything talons swing, and its body moves with perfect efficiency because it has no will of its own to interfere with the hive mind's directives. There's no hesitation, no fear, no self-preservation instinct that might cause it to falter. The organism is simply an extension of something far greater, a single cell in a body spanning light years. Fans have long debated whether this control represents true mind control or something even more fundamental. The consensus seems to be that most Tyranid organisms don't actually have minds to control in any meaningful sense. They're biological automatons, creatures specifically engineered to receive and execute commands without any internal consciousness getting in the way. Their brains, if you can even call them that, are essentially organic receivers, hardwired to interpret psychic signals and translate them into physical action. The hive mind doesn't need to override their will because they were never designed to have one. They're tools, weapons, extensions of a greater purpose, and they fulfill that purpose with mechanical precision wrapped in organic flesh. The range of this control varies depending on the strength of local synaptic creatures and the proximity of hive fleet command organisms. In the heart of a Tyranid invasion, where multiple hive tyrants and countless warriors maintain overlapping fields of synaptic control, the coordination is absolutely seamless. Organisms move in perfect synchronization, adapting to changing battlefield conditions in real time as the hive mind processes incoming sensory data and adjusts its strategy accordingly. But push out to the edges of this network and you start to see the limitations. Tyranid organisms operating at the fringe of synaptic range sometimes exhibit slight delays in response, moments of hesitation as the signal weakens. And when that connection breaks entirely, when the synaptic creatures are killed and the psychic network collapses, something terrifying happens. Without synaptic control, most Tyranid organisms revert to base instinctual behavior. They become feral, driven by simple biological imperatives rather than coordinated strategy. Hormagaunts will still attack nearby enemies, but without direction or purpose. Carnifexes might rampage mindlessly rather than targeting priority objectives. The swarm transforms from a precision instrument into a chaotic mass of individual predators, and while still dangerous, they lose the terrifying efficiency that makes the Tyranids so unstoppable. This vulnerability has been exploited by Imperial forces countless times. Kill the synapse creatures, and the swarm loses its coherence. But here's the thing that keeps commanders awake at night. The hive mind learns from every engagement, and it's been steadily creating more redundant synaptic networks, breeding more resilient command organisms, and adapting to counter this exact strategy. Text length, 5,359. The psychic scale of the hive mind is something that genuinely breaks the conventional understanding of what psychers can achieve in the 41st millennium. We've talked about how it controls its organisms, but now we need to confront just how overwhelmingly powerful this entity is in terms of raw psychic might. Every major faction in the galaxy has their psychers, their sorcerers, their warp-touched champions. The Imperium has its librarians and astropaths. Chaos has its demon princes and sorcerer lords. The Aldari have their farseers and warlocks. These are beings of tremendous power who can reshape reality, peer into the future, and unleash devastating mental attacks. But when you compare any of them to the hive mind, you're essentially comparing a candle flame to a supernova. The sheer psychic output of the hive mind is measured not in individual power levels, but in the collective resonance of billions of synapse creatures, all broadcasting simultaneously. Each hive fleet represents a fraction of the total hive mind's attention, and yet even these fragments possess enough psychic presence to fundamentally alter the warp itself across entire star systems. When a hive fleet enters a region of space, the local warp doesn't just become dangerous, it becomes utterly unusable. Astropathic communication ceases entirely, navigator abilities become worthless, and even the most powerful psychers find their connection to the immaterium either completely severed or twisted into something monstrous and hostile. Fan theorists have long debated whether the hive mind's psychic power is qualitatively different from other warp entities or simply quantitatively overwhelming. The evidence suggests it might be both. Unlike chaos, which draws power from emotions and feeds on specific aspects of mortal experience, the hive mind generates its own psychic field through the biological processes of countless organisms. It doesn't need worship, it doesn't need belief, and it doesn't need the emotional fuel that sustains the dark gods. It simply exists as a self-perpetuating psychic phenomenon that grows stronger with every world consumed and every biomass absorbed into its endless swarm. What makes this even more terrifying is that the hive mind appears capable of directed psychic assault on a scale that would make even Magnus the Red pause. Zoanthropes and maleceptors serve as focal points for devastating psychic attacks, channeling the collective will of the hive mind into concentrated blasts of pure mental energy. These creatures have been documented annihilating entire armored columns with single-focused thoughts, reducing battle-hardened space marines to screaming husks whose minds simply cannot withstand the pressure of billions of alien consciousnesses pressing against them. The infamous doom of Malantai was a single creature that drained an entire craft world of its psychic essence, killing thousands of Eldari and absorbing their souls before growing into something even more nightmarish. The really unsettling part is that these manifestations of psychic power are essentially overflow, excess energy that the hive mind directs toward immediate tactical goals. The true depth of its psychic capability remains unknown because it has never needed to fully exert itself. Every engagement with the Tyranids represents the hive mind using the absolute minimum force necessary to achieve its objectives, conserving resources for the greater consumption to come. Imperial scholars who have studied Tyranid engagements believe that if the hive mind ever focused its full psychic attention on a single target, the result would be extinction on a scale that makes Exterminatus look gentle. There's a fan theory that gained significant traction, suggesting the hive mind's psychic presence is so immense that it doesn't just block the warp, it actively competes with it for dominance over the immaterium. Some believe that if the Tyranids ever consumed enough biomass and psychically active species, the hive mind could potentially overwhelm the Chaos Gods themselves, not through combat, but through sheer psychic weight. Imagine a consciousness so vast that it simply drowns out the screaming madness of the warp, replacing infinite chaos with infinite hunger. Whether this is possible remains speculation, but the fact that such theories exist speaks to just how incomprehensibly powerful the hive mind has become in the collective imagination of those who study it. The psychic scale here isn't just about power, it's about presence. The hive mind doesn't think in terms of individual battles or even individual wars. Its psychic awareness spans millions of light years, coordinating invasions across multiple galaxies simultaneously, while still maintaining perfect control over every single organism within its vast domain. The shadow in the warp is perhaps the most viscerally terrifying manifestation of the hive mind's presence, and it represents something that fundamentally changes the rules of warfare in the 41st millennium. When a Tyranid hive fleet approaches a system, it doesn't just bring biological horrors and endless swarms of chitinous nightmares. It brings a phenomenon that makes psychers scream, severs entire worlds from the Imperium's communication network, and creates a zone of absolute psychic darkness that spreads like a cancer across the stars. This isn't some side effect or minor inconvenience. This is a weapon of strategic devastation that cripples civilizations before a single Tyranid organism ever makes planetfall. Imagine you're an astropath on some frontier world, dutifully sending and receiving messages through the warp, maintaining the fragile threads of communication that keep the Imperium functioning. Then one day, you feel it, a pressure building in your mind, a static that grows louder and louder until it becomes a deafening roar of psychic white noise. The messages stop getting through. Your attempts to reach out into the warp meet nothing but an impenetrable wall of alien hunger, and the closer the fleet gets, the worse it becomes. Some astropaths simply go mad from the exposure, their minds shattered by contact with something so vast and so utterly alien that human consciousness cannot process it. Others experience visions of endless consumption, of being devoured not just physically but spiritually, their very souls dissolving into an ocean of collective hunger. The tactical implications of the shadow in the warp cannot be overstated. The Imperium relies entirely on astropathic communication and warp travel to coordinate its forces across the galaxy. When the shadow descends on a sector, that coordination evaporates. Distress calls never reach their destinations. Reinforcement requests vanish into the psychic static. Fleet movements become impossible to track or predict. Worlds under attack find themselves completely isolated, unable to warn neighboring systems or call for aid. By the time anyone realizes something is wrong, the Tyranids have already consumed everything and moved on to their next target. This is why Hive fleet incursions are so catastrophic, not just because of the overwhelming numbers, but because the shadow ensures that humanity cannot mount an effective coordinated response until it's far too late. What makes this phenomenon truly fascinating from a lore perspective is that it appears to be both a natural byproduct of the hive mind's presence and a deliberately weaponized tool. The sheer concentration of psychic energy required to maintain control over trillions of organisms creates interference in the warp simply by existing, but there's evidence suggesting the Tyranids have learned to intensify and direct this effect for maximum strategic impact. Certain synapse creatures seem to amplify the shadow's effects in their vicinity, creating dead zones where even the most powerful psychers find their abilities severely diminished or completely nullified. This suggests an awareness of how devastating the shadow is to their prey and a willingness to exploit that advantage ruthlessly. The experience of fighting within the shadow in the warp is described by survivors as uniquely horrifying. Space Marine librarians report feeling cut off from their powers, their connection to the warp smothered by the overwhelming presence of the hive mind. Imperial-sanctioned psychers often suffer nosebleeds, seizures, and complete mental breakdowns when attempting to use their abilities. Even non-psychers report a sense of wrongness, a feeling of being watched by something impossibly vast that regards them with the same interest a human might show an ant. The shadow doesn't just block psychic communication, it creates an atmosphere of existential dread that saps morale and makes coordinated resistance incredibly difficult. Fan theories about the shadow in the warp often focus on what it might mean for the nature of the hive mind itself. Some argue that the shadow is evidence that the hive mind exists partially within the warp, that its psychic presence is so overwhelming it literally displaces other warp entities and energies. Others suggest that the shadow might be a defensive mechanism, a way of protecting the hive mind's psychic network from chaos, corruption, or demonic interference. There's even speculation that the shadow could be the hive mind's way of feeding on psychic energy, that it consumes the warp presence of everything it engulfs and adds that power to its own. Whatever the truth, the shadow in the warp remains one of the most effective weapons in the Tyranid arsenal, a phenomenon that turns the galaxy's reliance on psychic communication into a fatal vulnerability and ensures that when the hive fleets come, their prey faces them alone, isolated, and utterly helpless. The theory that the hive mind might be evolving into something resembling a chaos god is one of those ideas that keeps dedicated lore enthusiasts awake at night, because the implications are genuinely universe-altering. We know how chaos gods are born. They coalesce from the collective emotions, thoughts, and psychic imprints of sentient beings across the galaxy. Khorne was fed by rage and bloodshed, Nurgle by despair and decay, Tzeentch by ambition and change, Slaanesh by excess and sensation. These entities didn't simply appear. They grew, they accumulated, they became something greater than the sum of their parts through the sheer weight of psychic energy directed towards certain concepts. Now consider what the hive mind represents. An unending, all-consuming hunger that has devoured countless galaxies worth of biomass and psychic potential over millions of years. Some theorists in the fandom have pointed out that the hive mind already exhibits characteristics disturbingly similar to the chaos gods themselves. It exists partially within the warp, evidenced by how it creates the shadow in the warp and how Tyranid psychers channel their abilities. It feeds on something beyond mere physical matter. There's a reason why worlds consumed by Tyranids are left as dead husks, not just biologically, but spiritually. The psychic resonance, the accumulated memories, the very essence of civilizations disappears into the swarm. Where does all of that go? The obvious answer is that it feeds the hive mind, making it stronger, more aware, more present in ways that transcend the material universe. The really unsettling part of this theory involves the trajectory of growth. Chaos gods achieved their current state through the psychic contributions of trillions of beings over thousands of years within a single galaxy. The hive mind has been doing something similar, but on a scale that dwarfs anything the ruinous powers have experienced. If even a fraction of the consumed civilizations contributed to the hive mind's psychic mass, the way mortal emotions feed chaos, then we're looking at an entity that could potentially rival or exceed the dark gods in terms of raw warp presence. Some fans have speculated that this is precisely why the Tyranids create such absolute devastation. They're not just feeding bodies, they're feeding a nascent god. What makes this theory particularly compelling is how the Chaos Gods themselves seem to react to the Tyranid presence. There are scattered lore references suggesting that the ruinous powers view the hive mind with something approaching genuine concern. Chaos thrives on emotion, on conflict, on the endless cycle of hope and despair that mortal civilizations generate. The Tyranids represent the ultimate threat to that ecosystem. They don't just kill populations, they erase them so completely that nothing remains to feed the warp. Every world consumed is a world that will never again contribute to chaos. Every civilization devoured is an eternity of potential worship, fear, and emotional energy that simply vanishes into the swarm. The competition angle here is fascinating to consider. If the hive mind is indeed becoming something godlike, it would represent a fundamentally different type of warp entity, one defined not by any particular emotion, but by the pure concept of consumption itself. Hunger as a cosmic force, the drive to absorb and incorporate everything into a single unified whole. Some theorists have suggested that this makes the hive mind potentially more dangerous than the existing chaos gods because it doesn't need worshippers in the traditional sense. It doesn't require cults or rituals or belief. It simply takes, and in taking, it grows. There's also the question of what happens when something reaches critical mass in the warp. We've seen that sufficient psychic energy concentrated around a concept can birth new entities. The Eldar's hedonism created Slaanesh, after all. The hive mind has been accumulating psychic energy on a scale that makes the fall of the Eldar look like a minor incident. If there's a threshold where a psychic presence transforms into something genuinely divine, the hive mind might be approaching it with every galaxy it consumes. The horrifying possibility is that we're watching the birth of a new god in slow motion, and by the time anyone realizes what's happening, it will already be too late to stop. The consumption. God hypothesis takes the evolutionary theory we just discussed and pushes it into even more disturbing territory, because it attempts to define what kind of deity the hive mind might actually become if this transformation is truly occurring. The chaos gods we know each represent fundamental aspects of existence, filtered through emotion and experience: war, change, decay, pleasure. But a god born from the Tyranid hive mind would represent something far more primal and perhaps more terrifying than any of them. It would be a god of pure consumption, of hunger elevated to cosmic principle, of the absolute annihilation of everything that exists so that it might feed an eternal appetite. This isn't a god that wants your worship or your soul, or even your suffering in any meaningful sense. This is a god that simply wants to devour you completely, to break down every atom of your being and incorporate it into itself, leaving nothing behind, not even the memory that you ever existed. The philosophical implications of a consumption god are staggering when you really sit down and think about them. The chaos gods, for all their malevolence, still operate within a framework that acknowledges the value of existence. They want souls to corrupt, civilizations to twist, champions to elevate. They're parasites in the classical sense, feeding on their hosts while keeping them alive enough to continue providing sustenance. A consumption god operates on entirely different principles. It doesn't want to corrupt you or change you or make you suffer for eternity. It wants to end you so completely that the universe forgets you were ever there. Every world consumed by the Tyranids doesn't just lose its population, it loses its atmosphere, its water, its biomass, its minerals, everything that could possibly be processed and absorbed. The consumption god wouldn't be satisfied with merely eating the galaxy's physical matter either. If it truly achieved divine status, it might hunger for concepts themselves, for memories, for the very fabric of reality. Fan theorists have drawn fascinating parallels between this hypothetical deity and various mythological concepts of primordial chaos and void. Before the universe existed, there was nothing, and a consumption god might represent the universe's desire to return to that state of absolute emptiness. This connects interestingly with the Tyranids' apparent origin in the intergalactic void, that lightless expanse between galaxies where nothing exists and nothing grows. If the hive mind emerged from that void, perhaps it carries the void's nature within itself, an embodiment of nothingness that seeks to spread its essential emptiness across all of creation. The consumption god wouldn't be creating anything or transforming anything in any permanent sense. It would be unmaking reality, one bite at a time, until nothing remained but itself and an infinite hunger with nothing left to satisfy it. The implications for the warp itself are particularly fascinating when considering this hypothesis. The chaos gods exist within the warp, feeding on emotions and psychic energy that flows from the material universe. But what happens to the warp if the material universe is completely consumed? If every sentient being is devoured, if every source of emotion and thought and experience is extinguished, the chaos gods would presumably starve. A consumption god might represent an existential threat, not just to the material realm, but to the immaterial one as well, a force that could potentially end the great game by simply removing all the pieces from the board. Some theorists suggest this might be why chaos, despite its nature, has occasionally seemed to work against Tyranid incursions in subtle ways. Even the dark gods might recognize that the hive mind represents something that threatens their very existence. The really unsettling aspect of the consumption god hypothesis is what it suggests about the nature of hunger itself as a cosmic force. We tend to think of hunger as a biological drive, something that evolved to ensure organisms seek sustenance and survive. But what if hunger is actually something more fundamental, something woven into the fabric of reality itself? The Tyranids might not have evolved their endless appetite. They might be expressions of a universal principle that existed before life itself. In this interpretation, the consumption god isn't being created by the hive mind's actions. It already exists in some nascent form, and the Tyranids are simply its avatars, the physical manifestation of cosmic hunger working to awaken its divine patron through sheer accumulated acts of consumption. Every world devoured, every species rendered extinct, every galaxy stripped bare adds another increment of power to this slumbering deity. What makes this hypothesis so compelling to fans is how it recontextualizes the entire Tyranid threat. They're not just an alien invasion or a galactic pest control problem. They're potentially the harbingers of universal apocalypse, the teeth and claws of a god that wants to eat everything that exists. The other factions fight for territory, for souls, for survival, for ideology. The Tyranids might be fighting for the birth of something that would render all those conflicts meaningless. And the truly horrifying part? There might be no way to stop it. You can defeat hive fleets, you can destroy bioships, you can even temporarily disrupt the hive mind's control, but you cannot kill hunger itself. The idea that the Tyranids might be fleeing from something worse than themselves is one of the most chilling theories in all of Warhammer 40k lore, and the evidence supporting it is disturbingly compelling when you start piecing it together. We've spent all this time discussing how terrifyingly powerful the hive mind is, how it controls trillions of organisms, how it might be evolving into a god of consumption. But now we have to confront a question that fundamentally reframes everything we thought we understood about the Great Devourer. What if the Tyranids aren't the apex predators of the universe? What if they're actually refugees, cosmic survivors running from something so catastrophically dangerous that even the most efficient biological killing machines in existence decided that flight was preferable to fight? The foundational evidence for this theory comes from the simple question of where the Tyranids actually came from. They emerged from the intergalactic void, from the vast darkness between galaxies where nothing should exist, where there's no biomass to consume, no stars to provide energy, no reason for a consumption-based organism to survive. The journey between galaxies takes millions of years, even at speeds we can barely comprehend, and the Tyranids somehow made this crossing intact, which means they left their previous hunting grounds deliberately. They didn't just wander into the Milky Way by accident. They came here with purpose, with direction, drawn by the Astronomicon, but also perhaps pushed by something behind them. And fans have obsessed over this detail for years because it suggests the Tyranids consumed everything in their original galaxy, stripped it completely bare, and then had to move on or starve. But what if consumption wasn't the only reason they left? The behavior patterns of the hive fleets support the fleeing theory in ways that many people overlook. The Tyranids don't just enter the galaxy from one direction. They're coming from multiple vectors, surrounding the Milky Way like predators circling prey. Yes, but also like survivors spreading out to avoid putting all their eggs in one basket. This is exactly what you'd expect from a species that learned the hard way not to concentrate all its biomass in one location. The hive fleets maintain separation from each other. They rarely combine their forces even when it might be strategically advantageous, and they seem almost paranoid about maintaining multiple independent approaches to the galaxy. Military strategists within the Imperium have noted this behavior and found it puzzling because a unified assault would be far more effective against the galaxy's defenders. But it makes perfect sense if the Tyranids are hedging their bets against something that could potentially destroy an entire concentrated hive fleet. There's also the question of what happened to the galaxies the Tyranids presumably consumed before reaching the Milky Way. The void between galaxies isn't just empty space. It's filled with the remnants of whatever existed before, and the Tyranids have been traveling through this void for eons. Some theorists in the fandom have suggested that the Tyranids didn't just consume their original galaxy. They were forced out of it by something that made continued existence there impossible. The scale of whatever drove them out would have to be incomprehensible, something capable of threatening a species that numbers in the trillions and spans entire star systems. We're talking about a threat that makes the Tyranids, the faction that terrifies every other species in the 40k universe, decide that running across millions of light years of empty void was the safer option. The temporal aspect of the Tyranid invasion adds another layer of evidence. The Hive fleets didn't arrive slowly and cautiously. They came in waves with increasing urgency, as if they were racing against some kind of deadline. Each successive Hive fleet has been larger and more aggressive than the last, suggesting escalation rather than simple expansion. Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, each one more devastating than its predecessor, each one pushing deeper into the galaxy with what almost seems like desperation. This isn't the behavior of a confident apex predator leisurely expanding its territory. This is the behavior of a species that knows something is coming behind them and needs to establish itself, to consume enough biomass to face whatever follows before time runs out. Fan theories about what might be chasing the Tyranids range from the terrifying to the cosmically incomprehensible. Some suggest another Tyranid-like species, perhaps the original template from which the Tyranids evolved, something even more efficient and deadly that outcompeted them in their home galaxy. Others propose ancient cosmic entities that predate the current universe, beings that exist in the spaces between realities and view even the Hive mind as nothing more than prey. There are theories about civilizations so advanced that they created weapons capable of sterilizing entire galaxies, forcing the Tyranids to flee or face extinction. The most disturbing theories suggest that whatever is coming isn't just dangerous to the Tyranids, it's dangerous to everything. And the Tyranids are essentially the warning system, the first refugees from an apocalypse that will eventually reach the Milky Way, regardless of what anyone does to stop it. The question of whether the Hive mind possesses true sentience or operates on some form of impossibly complex instinct is one of the most philosophically troubling debates in the entire Warhammer 40k universe, and the answer matters far more than you might initially think. We've explored its power, its scale, its potential godhood, and the terrifying possibility that it's running from something worse. But all of those discussions hinge on a fundamental question that nobody can definitively answer. Is there actually someone home in there? Or is it all just the most sophisticated autopilot system the universe has ever produced? The distinction between sentience and instinct might seem academic when you're being devoured by a swarm of hormagaunts, but it actually changes everything about how we understand the Tyranid threat. If the Hive mind is truly sentient, then it has goals, preferences, maybe even something resembling emotions or desires. It would mean there's a mind behind the consumption, a will directing the endless hunger, something that could theoretically be reasoned with, tricked or understood on some level. But if it's pure instinct operating on a cosmic scale, then the Tyranids are essentially a force of nature given biological form. You can't negotiate with gravity. You can't appeal to the mercy of entropy, and you certainly can't expect a hurricane to spare your world because you asked nicely. The evidence for genuine sentience is actually more substantial than many people realize. The Hive mind demonstrates clear strategic thinking that goes beyond simple predatory behavior. It learns from its encounters, adapts its tactics based on enemy responses, and shows what can only be described as creativity in developing new bioforms to counter specific threats. When the Tyranids encountered Space Marine Terminators, they didn't just throw more bodies at the problem. They developed specialized organisms designed specifically to crack open that ceramite armor. When they faced the Tau's advanced ranged weaponry, they evolved creatures with enhanced speed and stealth capabilities. This isn't the behavior of a mindless swarm following genetic programming. This is problem solving, and problem solving requires something resembling a mind. There are documented instances of the hive mind engaging in what appears to be deliberate deception and psychological warfare. Hive fleets have feinted in one direction to draw defenders away before striking at vulnerable targets. They've left seemingly defenseless worlds untouched to lure reinforcements into ambushes. They've even shown something that looks disturbingly like patience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, rather than simply attacking whenever prey is detected. These behaviors suggest planning, foresight, and an understanding of how other minds work, all hallmarks of genuine intelligence rather than sophisticated instinct. But the evidence for the instinct interpretation is equally compelling when you examine it carefully. The Tyranids show absolutely no capacity for communication in any meaningful sense. Every attempt to establish contact with the hive mind has resulted in either complete silence or the psychic equivalent of staring into an abyss that stares back with hunger but no comprehension. Sentient beings, no matter how alien, typically have some framework for interaction, some basis for exchange of information. The hive mind offers nothing but consumption. It doesn't negotiate, doesn't threaten, doesn't even acknowledge the existence of other minds as anything other than obstacles or nutrients. The uniformity of Tyranid behavior across all encounters suggests something more mechanical than conscious. A sentient mind, even a vast one, would presumably show variation, preference, perhaps even something like personality. But every hive fleet, every tendril, every splinter force behaves with the same relentless efficiency. There's no evidence of internal conflict, no suggestion that different parts of the hive mind have different opinions about strategy or targets. It's almost too perfect, too unified to be the product of genuine consciousness. Sentient beings disagree with themselves all the time. It's practically the definition of having a mind. But the hive mind never wavers, never hesitates, never shows any sign of internal debate. Some inquisitors who have studied the Tyranids extensively have proposed a third possibility that's somehow even more unsettling than either pure sentience or pure instinct. They suggest the hive mind might represent a form of intelligence so fundamentally different from anything else in the galaxy that our concepts of sentience and instinct simply don't apply. It might be aware in ways we cannot comprehend, making decisions through processes that have no analog in human or even Eldar cognition. We assume consciousness looks like our consciousness, that thinking resembles our thinking. But the hive mind might be proof that intelligence can take forms so alien that we literally cannot recognize it as such. The implications of each interpretation are staggering. If the hive mind is sentient, then humanity isn't just fighting a swarm. It's fighting a mind that has been planning and adapting for millions of years, that has consumed countless civilizations and absorbed their knowledge, that views the galaxy not as a collection of obstacles, but as a carefully considered meal. If it's pure instinct, then the Tyranids are essentially unstoppable because you cannot defeat evolution itself, you can only temporarily survive it. And if it's something beyond both concepts, then we're dealing with a form of existence that makes even the Chaos Gods look comprehensible by comparison. The concept of divine-level awareness when applied to the hive mind forces us to grapple with what godhood actually means in a universe where gods demonstrably exist and actively influence reality. We've questioned whether the hive mind possesses true sentience, but now we need to push further and ask whether it might possess something beyond sentience, something that transcends the normal categories we use to understand consciousness entirely. In the Warhammer 40k universe, we have clear examples of divine beings. The Chaos, gods exist in the warp as vast intelligences that can perceive across time, manipulate reality, create and destroy on cosmic scales, and interact with mortal worshippers through dreams, visions, and demonic manifestations. The Emperor sits on the Golden Throne as something that might be a god, might be becoming a god, or might be something else entirely. The Eldar gods existed before Slanesh devoured most of them. These are entities whose awareness operates on fundamentally different principles than mortal consciousness, perceiving patterns and possibilities that exist outside linear time, understanding the universe through frameworks that human minds literally cannot process without shattering. The question then becomes whether the hive mind's awareness operates at this level, and the evidence suggests something genuinely unsettling. It might exceed divine awareness in certain dimensions while remaining completely alien to it in others. Consider what the hive mind perceives at any given moment. It experiences the sensory input of trillions upon trillions of organisms simultaneously, processing information from countless biomorphs across multiple galaxies. It perceives through compound eyes, through echolocation, through psychic resonance, through chemical detection, through senses that have no human equivalent. It experiences space battles and ground wars and the slow digestion of worlds all at once, maintaining perfect awareness of every single organism in its swarms while simultaneously coordinating fleet movements across light years. This isn't just multitasking on a grand scale. This is a form of omniscience within its domain that rivals what the Chaos Gods achieve through their connection to mortal emotions. But divine awareness isn't just about the scope of perception. It's about the depth of understanding and the ability to manipulate reality according to will. The Chaos Gods don't just see across the galaxy. They understand the patterns of fate. They manipulate probability. They exist outside time in ways that allow them to influence past and future simultaneously. Does the hive mind possess similar capabilities? The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous but increasingly suggestive. The hive mind's ability to predict and counter enemy strategies sometimes seems to exceed what should be possible through pure intelligence analysis. Fleet movements that account for decisions not yet made, adaptations that counter weapons not yet deployed, strategic choices that seem to reflect knowledge of events that haven't occurred yet. These patterns have led some Imperial theorists to speculate that the hive mind might perceive time differently than mortal beings, that its distributed consciousness across such vast scales might grant it some form of temporal awareness that approaches what the Chaos Gods possess. The implications of divine-level awareness for the hive mind are staggering when you consider the Tyranid purpose. A god-level intelligence dedicated entirely to consumption, possessing awareness that spans galaxies and potentially perceives across time, represents a threat that makes the Chaos Gods look almost reasonable by comparison. At least the Chaos Gods want something from mortal beings: worship, emotion, service, souls. They have interests that can theoretically be negotiated with, bargained around, or at least understood. A divine hive mind wants nothing except everything, understands everything except mercy, and would consume the Chaos Gods themselves if it could figure out how to digest pure warp energy. The fan community has spent countless hours debating whether such an entity could even be opposed in any meaningful sense, whether the entire struggle of the 41st millennium might be nothing more than the death throes of a galaxy that's already been claimed by something that perceives its consumption as inevitable across all possible futures. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that divine-level awareness might explain the hive mind's apparent patience with the galaxy. If it truly perceives at a god level, it might see the current conflicts as utterly insignificant, the resistance of the Imperium and other factions as nothing more than temporary inconvenience that will resolve itself given sufficient time. A being that perceives across millions of years might view the desperate battles of the 41st millennium the way humans view the struggles of bacteria: briefly interesting, ultimately meaningless, and certainly not worth expending significant resources to accelerate. This perspective transforms every Imperial victory against the Tyranids from a triumph into something far more hollow, a moment of respite granted by an entity that simply doesn't consider the defenders worth taking seriously. The unsettling mystery and what we still don't know, after everything we've explored about the hive mind, its incomprehensible scale, its psychic dominance, its potential godhood, the terrifying possibility that it's fleeing something worse, and the philosophical nightmare of its possible sentience, we arrive at the most uncomfortable truth of all. We still don't really know what this thing is. And that uncertainty, that fundamental gap in our understanding, might be the most disturbing aspect of the entire Tyranid phenomenon. The Imperium has fought the hive mind for centuries now, sacrificed billions of lives against its endless swarms, and yet the greatest minds of humanity remain essentially ignorant about the nature of their enemy. Not just tactically ignorant, but existentially ignorant. They don't know if they're fighting an animal, a god, a refugee, or something that doesn't fit into any category their minds can comprehend. The Ordo Xenos has dedicated countless resources to studying captured Tyranid organisms, and they've learned a tremendous amount about the biology, the synapse network, the consumption processes, and the tactical patterns. But every answer they find generates 10 new questions that seem fundamentally unanswerable. They can dissect a hive tyrant and understand how its brain processes synaptic commands, but they cannot determine whether the consciousness directing those commands experiences anything resembling thought or feeling. They can map the psychic signatures of approaching hive fleets, but they cannot determine where those fleets originated or what their ultimate purpose might be. They can observe the shadow in the warp and measure its effects, but they cannot explain how a biological phenomenon produces such profound metaphysical consequences. The knowledge gap isn't shrinking as humanity learns more about the Tyranids. If anything, it seems to be expanding as each discovery reveals new layers of mystery beneath. What makes this uncertainty so unsettling is that it's not the kind of mystery that time and research will necessarily solve. The hive mind might be fundamentally incomprehensible to human cognition, not because humans lack intelligence, but because the hive mind operates on principles that human minds literally cannot process. It's like asking a two-dimensional being to understand depth. The conceptual framework simply doesn't exist. The greatest human psychers who have touched the hive mind's consciousness have universally reported that the experience shattered their understanding of what consciousness could be. They didn't come back with clarity or insight. They came back broken, unable to articulate what they encountered because human language and human thought simply cannot contain it. The mystery might not be solvable because the solution requires a type of understanding that humanity is incapable of achieving. The fan community has spent decades theorizing about the hive mind's true nature, and the diversity of those theories reflects just how genuinely unknown this entity remains. Some believe it's a weapon created by the Old Ones that outlived its creators and continued its directive long after anyone remained to command it. Others theorize it's the psychic remnant of an entire galaxy consumed long ago, a gestalt consciousness formed from trillions of absorbed minds that now hungers to add more to its collective. Some suggest it's a natural phenomenon, an inevitable emergence of consciousness when biological life reaches sufficient scale and complexity, meaning that given enough time, any galaxy might produce its own hive mind. Others believe it's something that existed before the current universe, a survivor from a previous cosmic cycle that persisted through the Big Bang and now feeds on the life that emerged from the ashes. Each theory has evidence supporting it, and none can be definitively proven or disproven. The consequences of this uncertainty are profound and deeply troubling for every faction in the galaxy. The Imperium cannot develop effective long-term strategy against an enemy it doesn't understand. They can win battles, they can defend systems, they can slow the advance, but they cannot determine whether any of these actions actually harm the hive mind or simply prune branches that will regrow stronger. They don't know if killing a billion Tyranid organisms causes the hive mind pain, satisfaction, or nothing at all. They don't know if there's a way to negotiate, a way to redirect, a way to satisfy the hunger through some means other than total galactic consumption. They're fighting blind against an enemy that might be infinitely patient, infinitely adaptable, and infinitely beyond their comprehension. The final truth about the hive mind is that it represents the limits of knowledge itself, a reminder that the universe contains things that conscious beings may never fully understand, and that those things don't care whether they're understood or not. If you enjoyed diving into this mystery with me, consider subscribing to the channel for more explorations of the darkest corners of the 40k universe.